So at the weekend, trans activists were protesting outside JK Rowling's house. It feels like in the last week or so in particular, the vicious campaign against JK Rowling has really ramped up a notch. I mean, Tom, you've written about essentially the making of JK Rowling into a folk devil.
Yeah, it was just another opportunity to sort of reflect on that, because I think if you'd have told anyone like 5 or 10 years ago that JK Rowling would become the most controversial cultural figure of our time, they'd have been so bemused by that. This, beloved children's author, inspired this generation of young people with a love of reading Harry Potter books, not much else as it turned out, but nevertheless, this huge cultural import, and genuinely someone who on all other issues seems to have all of the correct opinions, shall we say, would become such of a hate figure. And as you say, it kind of escalated this week because the kind of online vitriol sort of became offline when these 3 kind of actors / trans activists showed up outside of her house. JK Rowling suggests that they kind of purposely displayed part of her address, which obviously is just could be an invitation for more protest, more agitation, and all the rest of it. And it's at time whenever this flares up, and it flares up every couple of months, really, you always have to remind yourself, first of all, she doesn't talk about this issue all the time.
Yeah.
Really, the issue of assent, and also the content of what she believes on this is the most kind of mild, generous, sympathetic form of gender critical feminism, if you want to call it that you could possibly see. I mean, the most substantial statement she's ever made on this is that essay she published last year, where she talks explicitly about the fact that as a survivor of domestic violence and sexual assault, that her concern is women-only spaces, that she has endless sympathy and solidarity for trans women, particularly those who are targeted by male violence, etc., etc. And it's just on this particular issue, as well as the kind of destruction of womanhood as a category because of extreme gender ideology. That's all she said. And that is a position that I think most people in this discussion can get on board with. And yet, if you ask any kind of right-thinking person why JK Rowling is in the crosshairs, because she's a vicious transphobe.
Yeah.
And if you ask them for any examples of it, they'll just sort of stare into the distance, because there aren't any. There's really not. And I think the fact that she's in this position is because of the fact that to be someone that prominent who refuses to comply with every dot and comma of this ideology is enough to turn you into this monster.
Yeah.
But for doing and saying so incredibly little, it feels like.
In some ways, she's kind of been turned into Voldemort. She's the woman who can't be named. She is not going to be appearing in this HBO reunion special of the first Harry Potter film. She's had her name removed from a house in a London primary school. I mean, what is all that about? It's not even just people criticizing her. It's that they cannot even tolerate the presence of this beastly woman.
Well, she got almost completely wiped from the 20th anniversary celebrations. Ungrateful little twerps like Daniel Radcliffe and Emma Watson.
Are you not saying they never would have succeeded on their own?
Great actors that they are,
failing to stand in solidarity with a woman who really, through her work, I'm not the biggest fan of Harry Potter books, but, through a considerable amount of work managed to make their careers. You're right, she has become the person who can't be named. I mean, even actually there was a tweet that got put out, I think Julie Bindel put it out, of a display in Barnes and Noble in America, bookshop, which had a display of unproblematic wizarding books. So, it's gotten to that ridiculous level. But the thing that I always think about is so much of the an ire given to Rowling and people like women like her, because it is mostly women, is this idea of you just keep talking about women's spaces, you're oppressing us, you're not letting us talk about what we really need to talk about, which is suicides of trans people and all that kind of stuff. And yet the one thing everyone wants to talk about is JK Rowling. Why are they so obsessed with her? Why aren't they saying, okay, you publish an essay on sex-based rights or whatever it is you want to do, and we don't care. We want to talk about resources or things like that. There has become an obsession, and I think it shows the superficiality of the discussion around gender and gender ideology, because it isn't about material rights. It isn't about let's build more rape crisis centres that can fit all kinds of people in there. Let's find out compromises and ways of doing things like this. Let's have more access to gender neutral stuff if we want to. It's about saying, I don't like what you've said, and what you've said affects your words, your singular essay or your singular tweet affects the very nature of my being. And that's not rational. There's nowhere you can go with that. And it also leads to irrational acts like publishing someone's address online, which, this whole thing of doxing gets thrown around all the time. And people often see trans activists themselves online, the more vicious ones, complaining of themselves being doxed and having complaints to their employers. And when it comes to someone like Rowling, because she's a folk devil, no one cares. I mean, you've even had some quite high profile political commentators in the UK supporting the fact, or at least suggesting that it's not so bad that people have turned up at her address. How has that been allowed to happen?